The points that he missed, Steve, and I think they're quite important points, the fact that this is a trade organised by serious criminals, gun-carrying in many cases now criminals, capable, in fact, of even murdering each other, and there have been some recent specimens of that. He didn't mention that. He didn't mention the drownings in the Channel and the fact that if we stop people coming via this route, the drownings will stop. He didn't mention what happens, and you know as well as I do, that a lot of these people who come into this country finish up effectively in slave labour type conditions here. He didn't mention any of those things. Wouldn't it have been better to give it at least some sense of balance in terms of what he said?
Well, I think what he had to say was completely pertinent to what is happening now and what the government proposes. I'm happy to address those things that you've mentioned. They're all extremely important.
They are.
The problem is this. The government's policy doesn't address those matters. You can't stop and penalise and punish and track down those who perpetrate people smuggling and human trafficking in all its most vileness by simply punishing and penalising its victims after they've already been so abused and exploited.
Well, the argument, Steve, the argument goes that on average, the traffickers are paid in sterling about 2,500 for each trip, in some cases more. The argument goes that if these young men, and I emphasise young men because it is 90% male, as you and I both know, that come over the Channel, if they think that spending that money may lead to them going to Rwanda, they'll stop spending the money. I mean, isn't that the point? The government is doing this as a disincentive.
Well, first of all, the government has made an assessment, an impact assessment of this policy and others that it is pursuing at the moment. And that impact assessment has told it that there is no or little evidence to suggest it has any prospect of working, which is why it has been reported, and I'm sure some of your viewers have seen, the permanent secretary at the Home Office had to require the Home Secretary to instruct him to nonetheless go ahead with this because he couldn't sign it off on the financial costs, merits of this, because the evidence doesn't suggest it can work. And the reason the evidence doesn't suggest it can work is quite simply this. People on these journeys are on the whole not in a position to assess what's going to happen to them at the end. If they are being trafficked,
oh no, they are.
To be in control.
Oh no, they are, Steve. They are. Otherwise, they stay in France. They come here because they see 4-star hotels. They think we're Treasure Island, Steve. That's why they all want to come here. It's obvious, isn't it?
I think that's absolutely nonsense, I'm afraid. If that were the case, why is it that France continues to receive so many more people into its asylum system than do we?
Because they're on the Mediterranean. Because they're on the Mediterranean. Steve, France isn't choosing. France isn't choosing to have large numbers of people come in, but they're coming in across the Med. Final thought, Steve. Do you believe these proposals are, and you can say they're undesirable, and I understand you've said that. Do you believe these proposals are workable? Do you believe the flights to Rwanda will begin within the next month or so?
I don't know whether they'll begin within the next month or so. They may do. Do I think they're workable? No. And just one thought then in relation to that. Journalists have been shown, and have been shown now in our media over here, a few dozen beds that Rwanda has made available for this policy. Now, this country doesn't receive a large number of people seeking asylum, certainly not compared to its nearest neighbours in Europe, but it certainly receives more than a few dozen people. So how on earth we expect this policy to work even in its own terms, I honestly do not know. As for the cruelty that will possibly be done to people and the effect of our washing our hands of our responsibilities or trying to do that on whether other people will take their responsibilities, I dread to think.